This interview was made possible in part by a grant from Arts DFW.
Museum of American Art in Fort Worth to speak with artist James Prosek about his exhibition, Trespassers, James Prosek and the Texas Prairie. Hi James, thanks so much for meeting with us today.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Yeah, this is great. It's really nice to be in the space. So to start us off, can you just provide us a little bit of an overview about what the exhibition entails?
Or what it's about?
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I guess the Amon Carter, when they work with contemporary artists, try to do shows that are focused around Texas, and one of your illustrious curators, Spencer Wigmore, and I think a little bit his colleague Maggie too, but had an idea to do an exhibition about Texas grasslands and prairies. And Spencer grew up in Minnesota, so he knew about remnant prairies and grasslands and knew that grass as the foundation of grazing was an important part of Texas history. And so they'd borrowed a work for an exhibition they'd done, and we'd begun a conversation, and Spencer kind of asked, would you like to do a show about prairies? And I said yes. And at that point, I didn't know much about grass, but the foundation of my work is the natural world and my love of biodiversity and the interaction between humans and nature, whatever that means. Humans are part of nature, but and a lot of my work is also about that humans draw lines in nature, which is an interconnected world, but we have to sort of separate things into units in order to name them and discuss things. So what happens when we put words onto a world that doesn't have words on it? And that involves a kind of fragmentation and a reduction of a very complex interconnected system. And the prairies in Texas have a history that involves people drawing lines, but the forces that the prairie requires to remain healthy disobey boundaries. So fire, for instance, is the primary tool that indigenous people use to manage the land for thousands of years, because grass evolved to like fire because lightning strikes were part of the natural environment. But they accelerated that process because what fire does, among other things, is it reduces the amount of brush and trees and increases the amount of grass, which increases the number of grazing animals, which increases the protein yield, which means more food. So that's how we think the land was managed, basically. But when Europeans came and put up property lines and put up barbed wire fences and built houses, they started to suppress fire. And then they were like, well, where'd the grass go? And they didn't know that fire was a necessary part of that. So part of the show is about this tension between, which most of my work is about, the bounded world and the boundless world. Nature is really boundless. There are no sharp lines in nature. Obviously a cat is different than a tree, but at the same time they're interacting in an ecosystem, and just by breathing you're affecting the fates of other creatures in a system. But fundamentally, a lot of the work is about personal devotion to close observation, drawing things like wildflowers and grasses behind me. I would say the biggest component of the show are portraits of individual plants that I traveled around Texas to see. So as this guy, Matt White, who wrote a book called Prairie Time and has been very helpful in our research, he calls Texas a grassland state, and really the whole state was primarily a grassland. So for me, it's been a really big learning experience, and I've really enjoyed working with Spencer and other people. A lot of very helpful people in this state who love the environment or doing restoration work.
Well, great. Yeah. To kind of tie into that, your research and artworks have pretty much taken you all over the world. So you explained why you came to Texas, but Was there any parts of Texas that you found that were more interesting, or like some of the prairies were more interesting that you found?
Well, I would say most of my trips were in the what they call the Blackland Prairie, northeast of Dallas and Fort Worth. Partly because of convenience, partly because some of the people who were helping us lived in this region and knew the region. We had places where I could stay and paint. I went also to South Texas, the Hill Country, West Texas, the Davis Mountains, pretty much a lot of different parts of the state. And most of the places we went, or I wanted to see, were what we call remnant prairies, and that was a term I didn't know about until I started this show. Pieces of prairie that had never been plowed or overgrazed, and by some miracle still exist and aren't corn and soybeans or dirt and dust. And some of the places where these old prairie plants survive and the complex root systems between the grasses and the wildflowers survive are old cemeteries, because people started burying their dead there in the early 1800s when the prairies still existed, and because there were gravestones and even wooden grave markers and fences around the perimeter, they never plowed them or overgrazed them. So some of these cemetery prairies have rare prairie plants that don't exist in other places. And I found that just really still I'm still grappling with a lot of the things that I've seen and learned, but when you go onto a remnant prairie, you're basically stepping into like a time capsule, because this is what this continent looked like 200 years and before Europeans kind of came. And so there's not a lot of opportunities to see what the land maybe looked like before we made a lot of changes to the land.
A lot of your illustrations really remind me of like scientific studies, and particularly the way you've done the handwritten labels and everything. So I'm curious if you see your work as being a distinction between art and science, if there is a distinction between that, or if there's more correlation.
Well, I'm not trained as a scientist, but I grew up with a father who was he was first in the Merchant Marine, and then he became a science teacher in schools in Trumbull, Connecticut. And he was really interested in evolution, and he was reading, when I was a kid, some of these popular evolutionary biologists, E.O. Wilson, Stephen Jay Gould. So the idea that nature's this interconnected system, this continuum, and all life is related to every other organism going back hundreds of millions of years to single-celled organisms was embedded in my head. Also an appreciation for the natural world, which he kind of imparted through his love of birds. He grew up in Brazil and fell in love with birds as a kid there. So my father had an influence in introducing me to science-y thoughts. He was also reading poetry, and I like to sort of soften the boundaries between these disciplines, but science relies on a strict system of collecting data and kind of drawing conclusions from that data. I don't have the temperament for that, so
Right.
As an artist, I guess I make observations that could be considered borderline scientific, but that's not my mission. My mission is more to show the individuality of different, in this case, plants. Like these pictures behind me are not like field guide illustrations where you have a picture of a prairie paintbrush that's a reduced version of a prairie paintbrush to represent all prairie paintbrush so that somebody in the field can identify a prairie paintbrush. These are portraits of individual plants and grasses, and if a bug ate the leaf, I like to put those little scars and scabs, the residue of these plants' personal experiences in nature in the picture. And they're also, a lot of them, fragmented in pieces. That started a little bit as a practical thing because I couldn't bring 8-foot sheets of paper out in the field sometimes. So I started drawing the grasses across the boundaries of the paper. But then I thought, well, this kind of communicates conceptually what I've been trying to say in part about what has happened to the prairies. You look at the prairies from the air now and it's just a bunch of grids and lines, and part of that goes back to the Homestead Act, where you could get like 160 acres from the government and it was basically a block. And so what an environment that needs unboundedness has become a geometric grid. And part of the reason, again, why the title of the show is Trespassers is because the forces that, grasses need to be healthy, like I mentioned, fire, but also animals that move and migrate across these boundaries, they need to have a certain amount of ability to be fluid. And so another part of the exhibition is this silhouette mural behind you. And there's 2 deer jumping over a barbed wire fence, which is this, again, like story about trespassing. Monarch butterflies fly across the Mexican border every year. So we forget that things are moving and need to have the ability to move in order for nature to survive, but in a healthy way. Also on these, I consider these to be portraits of individual grasses and wildflowers, and each one has a shadow painted underneath it, which suggests that I plucked the plant, put it on a piece of paper, and there's a light source casting a shadow. And I've become, partly through this project, really interested in what shadows can do. I've always liked silhouettes and using silhouettes in my work, and they're almost like kind of a shadow. Some of the myths of the first drawings were that they were tracings of people's shadows on the wall. So I'm also interested in the origin of drawing and early cave paintings and depictions of nature. But yeah, I try to find ways to kind of mine the history of natural history, art, illustration, while putting a contemporary spin on it.
You spoke a little bit about medium and kind of how you put these things together. So this exhibition has like a whole variety of medium, like from the sculptures that we're looking at here to the silhouettes and then the more drawings. How do you decide what medium you want to do the work in, or does it just kind of come organically?
That's a good question. Watercolor, since I was a kid, watercolors have been the primary medium that I've worked in, and that's probably because that's sort of part of the tradition, and Audubon and Winslow Homer were heroes of mine, and a guy named Luis Agassiz Fuertes, who is a really beautiful watercolor painter of birds. But watercolors are also considered to be more fugitive and ephemeral. So I also like to make works that maybe are more permanent, and that's why bronze is a good medium for that. And so there's some sculptures in the middle of the gallery, including a self-portrait as a burned log with a little sprig of cedar elm coming out of it. And just because different media can communicate the same themes maybe in different ways, so it gives me an opportunity to just try to tell the story from different angles, like the story of how important fire has been in the evolution of humans, and used as a tool to manage the land, used as a tool to cook food, and the use of this tool has turned back and changed the evolution of our bodies, our dentition, because it changed what we could eat and how we ate it over thousands of years. It starts to shape our own bodies, so it's kind of this give and take. I like to use the tools that are available to me, and that also can include digital media, and I don't see any, it's just nice to embrace different ways of making things. There's a work at the end of the gallery that is a cluster of silhouettes of a lot of animals that live in the Texas Prairie and have lived in the Texas Prairie. In the center is the bison, which, is an iconic creature of the grasslands and was a big part of the Texas grassland ecosystem, and the cow has sort of replaced the bison. So that piece clusters a couple hundred silhouettes of animals, and then there's 17 animals I painted in color among the black and white silhouettes, and each one has a story, like the prairie dog, makes holes in the prairie and aerates the whole system. And even there's a Guadalupe bass, which is a native Texas fish, but the rivers are part of the prairie ecosystem. And there's a prairie chicken, which is now endangered in the coastal prairies near Houston, Atwater's prairie chicken. And so it's partly a piece about what was and what still is. And there's a green jay that, some of the birds that I saw during this project I hadn't seen before, like a green jay in far South Texas, or a painted bunting, which is a bird I'd always wanted to see, which is an extremely beautiful bird. So in facing that piece of the sort of native prairie is a counterpoint of the kind of Fort Worth cowboy culture that's evolved around living on grasslands, and the longhorn cattle is at the center of that. So they're sort of facing each other with no particular conclusion in mind, but just there.
That's great. It's wonderful to hear that you're inspired by Texas, and this is such a great show that shares a lot of that with us. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much.